Riders on the MBTA will have to pay fare increases averaging 9%. This will take effect in July. Officials approved smaller increases for subway and bus service, especially on rides by students and the elderly. But the increases for monthly passes were all 10% or higher. Joining us once again with reaction are two advocates for riders. We'd like to welcome the Outreach Director at Transportation for Massachusetts, Josh Ostroff, and the Program Director for the Alliance for Business Leadership, Sebastian Zapata. Thank you both very much for being with us.
So glad to be back. It's been a while.
I want to start with Josh. We've heard a lot of people saying this is just way too much, but how bad is this?
Well, for many people it's not significant, but for others it is. For riders for who may see an increase of 15, 20 cents a ride, for an occasional rider, it doesn't matter. But if you are, a minimum wage worker at a hotel or restaurant, or if you have, working multiple jobs and you need a bus to get in between them and it's not as reliable as it should be, it's a burden. It's a burden in this age when so many people are struggling. So, and as we said before, for those who can afford it but have other options, we may see them clogging Boston's congested streets. So this is a concern to us, but fundamentally, we have to move on. At least that's the way I look at it, that they made their decision, and July 1st there will be a fare increase. People will certainly continue to speak out, maybe act out. We could see civil disobedience the way we did at the board meeting yesterday. But from a policy standpoint, I think that we need to take the control board and the Mass DOT secretary at their word. They want to invest in the system. Let's talk about what those investments need to be.
Sebastian, the Alliance, I imagine a lot of what you represent are people who ride the T 5 days a week. They buy monthly passes. How do you think this is going to affect them?
So I think this is very interesting as to what happened yesterday. So for students and the elderly, seniors, their passes did increase, not as much as what was originally proposed, which is fantastic, but still more than the 5% from what the legislature intended in 2013, as we should all remember. But in terms of your average person who buys a Link Pass, the Link Pass is about to go up by almost $10, about $9.50. So that's a huge increase in our opinions over at the Alliance. And for a lot of businesses, that's going to see a big impact into bulk purchases that they would buy for their employees.
Josh, what about the logic here that you might as well have as much pain as you can right now, and maybe things will get so much better in a couple of years that it'll be a lot easier to maybe talk about new revenue and expansion even?
It could be. I think that it's never too soon, even if it's not politically desirable or expedient, but it's never too soon to be talking about revenue in the big picture. We are so far behind. In just the past few years, Denver has laid miles and miles of streetcar, light rail throughout their city and the suburbs. Other cities are really looking at this aggressively. No question that the MBTA needs to fix what's broken. But we are urgently in the position of needing to think of what's going to be needed down the road, or even for today's needs, so that the businesses that are looking to expand know that their workforce and their customers can get there. So, yeah, maybe it'll be a year or 2 years, and we'll be talking about some comprehensive statewide revenue package for transit, for rivers, for bridges and roads. That conversation's overdue, but I guess the political reality is that we're not ready to have the conversation yet. But the governor and his team do own these issues, and we're going to need to see improvement, continuous improvement in the MBTA. They're talking about a new dashboard that'll be rolled out soon so people can get a better sense of how well they're doing. I think that's all to the good. People really have high expectations of the system, and I look forward to seeing them actually start to redeem that promise and say, yeah, the money you're spending on fares is returning a better experience for riders, and now we know that we're going to need to ask people to invest more all throughout the state.
Sebastian, they're going to fix tracks and fix signals and the red line, the new trains for the red and the orange lines. But what about areas like the South Boston Innovation District, the Silver Line, and how long it takes that one traffic light still?
No, absolutely. And hopefully that is the case. Whether it's improved signal timing or decreased headways, either way, you have to be focused on this loss of productivity that is a result of delays or breakdowns on the MBTA. So for example, you mentioned the Silver Line in the Innovation District. So at D Street, a very simple solution to sort of increase productivity and wait times would be signal priority at D Street. for those that use the Silver Line, such as myself, to get to the Mass Design Center building. But again, this is more about access to opportunity in our minds, and it's more about investing long term, as Josh was saying. We need to move this conversation now that the fares will be going in place July 1st, about no longer looking at a Band-Aid, small situation, small fix situation. It has to be about increased investment for the future. We have to build to compete down the road. As Josh was mentioning, there are a lot of cities and towns out there that realize the trend no longer is suburbia. Younger generations want to not have cars. They want to have access to communities where they can walk everywhere or just use public transit as their main mode of access to transportation. So it has to be about building out moving forward.
Yes, Josh.
Could I add something? I'm glad Sebastian mentioned signal prioritization. I was meeting with Boston City Council President Wu's office earlier today. She's very focused on this issue of actually having transit priority for signals so that a bus gets a green light. So 40 people waiting for a bus get priority over 10 single passenger vehicles. That is a perfect opportunity where residents of the city of Boston and our elected leaders, our delegation, city councilors, and Mayor Walsh need to be advocating on behalf of these investments and improvements in the daily transit experience for riders. The time is now for people to speak up and speak out and make sure that these investments are being made immediately for their benefit.
Sebastian, what about the late night service? I know this affects the people, a lot of low-wage earners who work the night shift, but we also heard about this as one of these beacons that's supposed to attract young, innovative professionals here, too.
Right, so we'll see what happens. I mean, obviously, recently last week, the board did decide to cut the service, and then we saw the fiasco that the Federal Transit Authority said you can't cut that until you complete this survey, which they're now under the process of doing. So we'll see what the final result is, if they're actually going to nix the program. But there was a great article today from legislators in Beacon Hill saying that they demand that this not be cut until the survey and the study is completed. So hopefully we'll see. I think the demand is there for those that want to use it, so long as that they know that it's going to be there permanently, or at least for longer than just the pilot period. That way they can depend on it and it's reliable.
Josh, what about some ways of filling the gaps that the T doesn't see as being very cost-effective to continue serving? We talk about these ride-sharing companies that might want to pick up the slack here.
Sure. Well, we're in a new era of transportation planning and policy, and just at yesterday's meeting, one of the first speakers during the public comment section of the board meeting was from Uber, talking about how the Uber pool service could be available with a ride cap of $5 for a late-night service. I can't say what people will be doing, 3-5 years from now. If it's not going to be the fixed route service that the MBTA has today, it needs to be something, because we need to support the overnight economy in Boston. We cannot pretend if we're a world-class city and have no transit service available between the hours of 1 and 5. That's just not viable. So our coalition, Transportation for Massachusetts, we approach this with an open mind. We know that there needs to be changes. I hear of the MBTA, their concerns about doing maintenance overnight on their tracks and stations that they need to shut down in order to stage their crews and do work that needs to be done. So they could be right. Maybe we can't have the late night subway that other cities have, but we're going to need to provide transportation alternatives for tomorrow's workforce.
Sebastian, you talk about access to opportunity. When I was growing up in Boston, the poorest people live fairly close to downtown, and now it's quite different. They're likely to have these long commutes, and a lot of them either they can't drive or they can't afford a car. So what do we do about that?
Absolutely. So you are seeing this rapid gentrification in the city of Boston. It's high up there in terms of levels of income inequality. I believe it's number 1, depending on what survey you look at, but either way, it's up there in terms of cost. And so more and more folks that are lower income are getting pushed out further and further. So the question is, what do you do about getting them access to opportunity, access to public transit? So we have to understand, where should we be building? And it sort of harkens back to yesterday's conversation about, where are we building housing? How are we building it around public transportation? So we should do a deep analysis as to how we sort of build these new lines moving forward. And again, long-term investment, planning it out, knowing that these communities need access to opportunity, access to transit, and building around that.
Josh, what about the connection to housing here? Because on the one hand, maybe the state could change the mix of incentives that for communities that allow a lot of housing, they might get a break on transportation, or maybe they should chip in more to transportation if they're going to get more service too.
I guess so. You know, the housing bone is connected to the transportation bone. People really want to live in areas where they have good access to transportation and great sidewalks, pedestrian, biking infrastructure. That's where the demand is. And the demand for housing in the city of Boston is extraordinary. But that does not necessarily mean that's more revenue for Boston. I mean, developers may pay, fees, and there may be increased property taxes, but there's also additional, school population. So, the cost of services go up. I think that we need to provide more comprehensive statewide options for transportation. And the state knows that we need to create hundreds of thousands of new housing units in the next 20, 30 years in order to accommodate tomorrow's workforce. I mean, so Sebastian's member companies, they want to expand, they want to invest in Boston. But people in those companies are not going to be commuting from 40 miles away by car. They want to actually live in the city or close by the city with good transit. So it's a statewide imperative. If we're going to see the revenue from these, technology and other companies, decades from now, we need to be investing in the housing and transportation today.
Sebastian, with your companies, is it just those neighborhoods where all those young folks live, in South Boston, the Innovation District, the South End? Are we talking about maybe some of the new housing that could be built in Mattapan and Hyde Park?
I mean, absolutely. But the thing about the Alliance is that it's not just one size fits all in terms of a business leader that would care about transportation. It's all of our members that care about transportation because they understand just how important it is to the impact and the economy of the Commonwealth. It's not just the MBTA and just a Boston issue, but what happens here is going to have huge ripple effects throughout the whole Commonwealth in terms of driving our economy and growing it out from here on out. So it's just about looking at long-term sustainability, long-term sustainable growth and investment in public transportation. For example, just today we had a board member of ours, Jim Roosevelt. He had a letter to the editor in the Globe saying how these fare increases are just not equitable. And he's a long-term health advocate, I was saying. But we also have another member who's a venture capitalist, C.A. Webb, who's huge on transportation. And she understands just how imperative it is to continue to invest.
Josh, what about the leadership here, especially in the Fiscal and Management Control Board, about shaking out some of the management practices, because between the money that's really saved and I guess the confidence that people have in the T, isn't there something to be said for what they've accomplished?
I give them a lot of credit for what they've been able to do. The time it takes to onboard employees at the MBTA is far too long. The time it takes to procure reliable vehicles is far too long. There's a lot of practices that need to be formed on the management side, on the labor side. Their whole operation really needs a closer look. And the board is really helping to drive that in a much more public way than has ever happened before. I do give them credit. They've got a difficult volunteer job to do, and they're doing it. As hard working as any public board that I've seen. At the same time, they have to be accountable to the riders. And I think that they know now that expectations are very high for them to deliver. So, they're getting their money's worth in terms of the problems that they've, bought into, and so has the governor. Because I think ultimately this comes down to Charlie Baker. And is he going to see the kinds of reforms and improvements of service on his watch that he has, taken ownership of?
Right. Thank you both very much, Josh Ostroff and Sebastian Zapata.
We'll have more news
in just a moment.